Hello, students. It's Dr. Macias, and I'm going to go over some tips for revising your research paper. And we have the camera turned off this time because I want to show you quite a few things on the screen here, and I don't need my little square with my head in it getting in the way of the images you're trying to look at. So I'm going to start off with an example paper here that I've pulled from a previous semester, and I've taken the student's name out, so this is anonymous, but this is a student who wrote a research paper on the effects of parent involvement in a child's emotional state. Great topic, and this is a pretty good paper, you'll see, but there are some ways that this person could revise it. We're going to talk about a few things in this video. We're going to talk about headings and formatting. We're going to talk about citations. We're going to talk about word choice and flow of your paper as you are writing it and revising it now to make sure that it flows nicely. And then we're going to look at a few just small editing issues like apostrophes and commas. Those are the really common issues that a lot of people deal with as they're trying to edit their papers. So we're going to take a look at this paper. And the first most obvious thing that we can revise and make sure is correct is the heading. So I've pulled up this APA sort of cheat sheet for you to look at that just gives an example of types of headings. So we have our first level 1, and that's the center boldface upper and lowercase heading. We've got the level 2, the level 3, 4, and 5. Now, depending on what kind of paper you're writing, you may only get to level 1 and or 2, but if you're writing a more extensive paper, then you may get all the way to 4 and 5. So in my thesis and my dissertation, I was using level 4 and 5 headings all the time. But those are very long, detailed papers, so it really depends on what you're writing. If you're writing a short research paper, like the one we're going to look at, often level 1 and maybe some level 2s is enough. So first, we're going to just look and see if this person is following that. We also have open the Purdue website's sample paper in APA that we can look at. So we see on this sample paper that they give you all these nice little boxes explaining what you're looking at. And this person has a heading here that's their title of the paper. They have their name and the name of their university. So our example paper did do that. They have their heading, which is their title of the paper, and they had their name. I took it out. And then they have the name of their university. So the only thing I notice is that there's only one capital letter here, and the rest of these are not capitalized. And so that is something that needs to be fixed, because if you see in this example paper, it is both upper and lower case throughout the title, okay? Let's jump down here. This one has an author note, and depending on who you are and what kind of program you're in and what you're writing, you may not need to do an author note. I often don't have my students use them because it tends to be more for people who are writing more extensive things, really large studies. And if you're just writing a research paper that is a synthesis of other people's work and not an original study, it's not likely you need to include that, but always check with your instructor. Next thing they have is an abstract, and this is often difficult for many people. A lot of people feel like an abstract is just something they're not used to writing and they don't know how to write one. And I always encourage people to just write one at the end. When you're done with the whole paper, go back and write an abstract. And it doesn't have to be really long. It's just a very short summary of all the key points in your paper. And so that's what they've included here. They also have keywords, which again, you should try to include. Make sure you check with your instructor and see if they expect that. But most of the time in APA, we do include keywords in the beginning. We don't have to define them right here, but we have to say what they are. And often throughout the paper, you will define them near the beginning so that the reader knows what you're talking about. And the only reason we choose to put our keywords up front here is that these might be specialized terms for our topic. Okay, so you want to introduce those early on. I see that this example paper does not have an abstract. So that's obviously the first key thing, is that we would have to make sure that we add an abstract. Okay, and so I'll just do that here. I'm not going to write one out, but I'll show you how it would go. We would need that to be centered, and we would write our abstract left aligned, of course. The heading is the only part that's centered. You would write your 3 or 4 sentences of a summary of everything that is in this paper. Then when we get to our actual beginning of the paper, we would then go and we would insert a page break and make sure that we move this down to the next page, okay? And for the sake of space, we're not gonna move it now, but just be aware that that's what you would do. So when we get to the beginning of the paper, we see that there is a heading again in the top, and it's the title of the paper. And it is also, once again, capital and lowercase letters. And this person didn't do that. Again, we need that capitalization going on. So I'm just going to highlight that to note it. Now, this person went ahead and wrote a little introduction here. And what I noticed was the introduction was pretty interesting. They chose to start with questions to get people thinking. That's fine. There's different ways you can do it. I think it just depends on the type of writing you're trying to achieve. Often it's not as necessary in APA to be entertaining or emotional about your paper. You want to just be straightforward. But I think sometimes it's okay to get people interested with some kind of colorful thinking and get people interested by asking a question. That's okay. They chose to put their thesis down here in the second paragraph, which is also fine. And this part I highlighted in green is the actual thesis, and the blue is just a couple sentences that I felt like we could probably revise. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. We have parental involvement is an important issue in education because it affects a child's emotional state when a parent is not involved. Sometimes just being physically present is not enough. Parents that may be nearby but that are not emotionally invested or responsive tend to raise children that are more distressed and less engaged with their play or activities. Okay, so I think I get the idea here of what this person is trying to say, but it is a little bit confusing. I think this is one of those sentences or a couple sentences where you knew what you wanted to say, but you kind of rushed through it and just put something and maybe didn't go back and reread it aloud to yourself to see what it sounds like. So we would definitely want to think about how could we change this and make it sound a little more user-friendly to the reader so it just flows nicer. So let's start with this first sentence. Parental involvement is an important issue in education because it affects a child's emotional state when a parent is not involved. Okay, I think this is okay, but the problem is we have a little bit of redundancy here. We have parent involvement here, right? And then we have parent not involved again here. So we don't really need to repeat. I think we know we're talking about parents, so we don't need to repeat that again. What we could say is parent involvement is an important issue in education because it affects a child's emotional state. And I think actually the best way to revise this would just be to cut off that ending. And I think that's fine. We don't really need to add that additional phrase of parent involvement again because we've already got it here. So let's look at the next sentence. Sometimes just being physically present is not enough. Okay, that's a interesting lead-in. Parents that may be nearby but are not emotionally invested or responsive tend to raise children that are more distressed and less engaged with their play or activities. Okay, first off, we have several things going on in this sentence. Parents that may be nearby but are not emotionally invested or responsive. This right here, I think we need to really be careful when we make statements like this. What do we really mean by this? And I think it's important in a research paper, especially in APA, that we are specific. So if we're going to introduce a topic like this, and maybe this paper will go on to explain in more detail what we mean by emotionally invested, but if not, then we've just made a really big statement here and we didn't really explain it. And so it's kind of dangerous if we start off like this and we don't really get into this. Now down here I see a heading, connection between parents' investment and children's competence. So maybe this paper will go on and explain that in detail, but I still think we could fix this so it's not misleading to the reader. Parents that may be nearby but that are not emotionally invested or responsive. So I think what we're saying is sometimes parents are around but not as involved as they should be. or according to what the experts think, right? So we could say parents that are less invested, and that would be enough to simplify this because it's a little confusing. Parents may be nearby, but that are not emotionally invested. Parents that are less emotionally invested, maybe that would be better. Maybe we could try that. Let's say parents that are less emotionally invested or responsive tend to raise children that are more distressed and less engaged with their play or activities. Okay, so now I would wonder first as a reader, how do you know this? Do you plan to prove this with research? If you do, then that's fine. But you want to make sure, go back down here and check your sources, check your evidence. And if you have evidence proving that, great. And don't be afraid to cite those people up here in your introduction. There is nothing wrong with putting citations in your introduction. Most good APA papers do that. You can see that up here, this person in their introduction has some citations. So that is fine. If we're going to make a strong statement and it is research-based, we need to prove that we have found that in research and we cite somebody, okay? So if I were writing this person some notes, I would just put citation, right? Where's the citation for this? If we say that parents who are less emotionally invested raise children that are distressed, do we have proof of that? Okay, so I think actually right here, since I'm on it, I can correct my own mistake. Parents who, they're people, so we want to say who. Parents who are less emotionally invested or responsive tend to raise children that are more distressed and less engaged with their play or activities. Okay, this would be great, again, if we had a citation. If not, then we need to be thinking about how can I maybe say something a little less of a strong statement that will not require a citation, like, you know, more emotionally involved parents can promote better engagement or something like that. Here we have our thesis statement. Let's take a look at that. This paper will present the many factors in how the lack of parent involvement can affect a child's emotional state and how it can also affect their academic performance. Okay, not a bad thesis statement. Let's see if there's anything we need to fix here. Let's read it one more time. This paper will present. I like this, actually. I think a lot of people really struggle with how do I say something that I'm going to do? How do I introduce this thesis? How do I put in here what this paper is about without just saying this paper is about? Well, it's okay to just say this paper. As long as you're not saying I think it's great to say this paper will present or this paper will argue. Something like that is fine. So this person did a great job with that. This paper will present the many factors in how the lack of parental involvement can affect a child's emotional state. Okay. The many factors in how the lack of parental involvement can affect a child's emotional state. I don't think it's really wrong, but I do think this in sounds a little strange to me. This in how, it kind of throws me off. So I would like to revise that, and let's think of a way we could say that might flow a little better. This paper will present the many factors. How about we just say several factors? This paper will present several factors related to parental involvement, maybe. I think that would sound a little bit better than in how. I think that just kind of sounds a little confusing. So I'm just going to say this paper will present several factors related to parental involvement and how, here's where our how goes, and how it can affect a child's emotional state. Now we also have a second statement here included, and how it can also affect their academic performance. So now, in order to not be redundant here with our wording, we want to change the second half, and maybe we can shorten it a little bit. We can say several factors related to parental involvement and how it can affect a child's emotional state. And let's just take all this stuff out, and their academic performance. There, now I think I've got a much more simplified thesis statement that is easier to read. This paper will present several factors related to parental involvement and how it can affect a child's emotional state and their academic performance. Okay, that's pretty good. I see up here I have some little notation here telling me that I've got something wrong. So let's check it. Parents who are less emotionally invested. It says less emotionally. Parents who are less emotionally invested or responsive tend to raise children. Okay. And then right here, what's our problem? Oh, just a space. Okay. So no big deal. I fixed those errors, and I think I've got a little bit of a better introduction now with a nice thesis that makes more sense and flows better. So now back to our headings, because I see we've got a heading here. And this is a common way to do it. You start with an introduction. Of course, we talked about how we would need an abstract here, of course, right? I've got a title on the beginning. This would be at the top of the page, because this would be all the way on the next page. Okay, so let's go ahead and just so we're not distracted by that, let's move it down. And you should probably just insert it. But for the sake of time, I've got my heading up here. I would have to add my capital letters, just like they did here. And I usually have an introduction. Maybe it's 1 or 2 paragraphs and a thesis statement, okay, or some kind of really clear goal for what the paper is. And then I might have my first level 1 heading. So let's take a look at our cheat sheet one more time. Our level 1 is the upper and lowercase, bold, and centered. That's not what I see here. So I would need to fix that. I need to center it. I need to upper and lower. So every word is going to have a capital letter instead of just the first one. So I'm going to go ahead and fix that. Now I can skip out on these words like and, the, in, unless it's the first one. I can get rid of that. I don't need the capital there. So connection between parents' involvement or investment, I'm sorry, and children's competence. Okay, so 1, I see an issue here. We don't need a colon after our heading. We just take that out. If we look at this example, there's no colon. If we look at our other example on the APA paper, sample paper, there's no colons. So we don't need that, okay? So I'm gonna take that out. I'm gonna go ahead and stick with just my heading here, centered, bold. And let's look at this again and read it and see, does this really flow nicely? Connection between parents' investment and children's competence. Okay, I think that makes sense. But I think we are a little confused with our S's and our apostrophes here. Okay, so this is a common mistake, and I think we need to be careful about this. We don't want to use apostrophes where they don't belong. So where do they belong? Okay, and if we are not sure, like right there, I took it out so you could see what would happen when you have that. Okay, children, that one's right. But I have another S over here with parents, and so I need parents to have some ownership of this investment, right? Just have children's have ownership of this competence, the parents have ownership of the investment. And now the only reason that I noticed that is that the S is a clue to me, and we had an apostrophe here, so it made me think about it. So that's what you should do in your own papers. So start looking for things that you've done right, and then see, well, did I do that right thing everywhere? Now, the trick with the word parents is it's plural. The trick with the word children is that children is already plural without the S. Child would be the singular. Parent without an S is singular, but parents, we've already got plural, right? So in this case, we want our apostrophe at the end because we want it to stay plural, okay? So we've got our headings fixed. Now, if I wanted to add more headings, the next level within that section would be level 2, and it would be left aligned, and it would be just the same as the first one, bold, upper, and lowercase. You'll notice that if I went all the way to a level 3, I would left align but indent it, not center it, but indent, which just means I hit the tab button. And then I'm going to have upper case in the beginning, and the rest is going to be lower with a period. And your paragraph starts right after. So this is a nice little cheat sheet, and you can just Google APA headings and you'll find it. Okay, so I have fixed my heading. If I had another heading, I would make sure that I did the level 2 appropriately. Now, I highlighted a section here because I wanted to point this out to you. And I think it's important for those of you writing research papers that you think about this. There's a section here where this person is talking about this research they found. They've cited somebody. They've got some explanation for it. It's a pretty long paragraph. So my first instinct is, well, maybe this is a little bit long and maybe it could be divided up into a couple paragraphs because it seems to be over a page, this one section. So we might want to think about dividing it up. Okay, so if you went to read it carefully, you would probably pick a spot that seemed natural. But I also want to point out that right here, in fact, actually, I think probably not this one, but right here, where I started this highlight in blue, it says, growing up, I remember my parents were involved in my education because they wanted me to be successful in life. And it goes on to talk about this personal anecdote. And the rest of the paper is not written that way. If we back up, we can read a sentence here just to give you an idea. Parental involvement begins at early stages of a child's development, not only when they begin school. If a parent shows invested in their child since they are born, it will show the child's emotional competence. Okay, so this person is writing very much in a third person objective manner. And then all of a sudden, we switch over to this first person anecdote. And so I think it's important that we really think carefully when we want to do something like this. Is this appropriate in a research paper? And more than likely, it is not. Now, I have a lot of students that are writing their research paper on things like their fieldwork. Okay, they're out at a fieldwork site and they're doing service learning or they're doing a project at a school site and they want to talk about that experience. That might be appropriate in that paper, but I still encourage them not to use I. In APA, we try not to do that, at least not in a traditional research paper. As you go along in your work and you move up and you start doing more detailed research, there's types of research where you do say I. In certain qualitative research studies, sure, you might do that. I just recently did one where we did use I. Me and the other co-authors, we used we and I. But that was a self-study, so that's a little more appropriate. Or certain other kinds of qualitative research, you might use I because you're talking about your positionality in that situation. However, for most research papers, especially if you are just pulling up other people's work and analyzing it and synthesizing it, then you really don't need to say I. And I would tell this person that there are ways to use this kind of idea and not use I. You could say something like, many people have personal examples of how their parents were involved and encouraged academic engagement. Something like that would be a very good one. You could say, many parents attend FAFSA workshops. Many parents can do this. I think that is a better way of talking about what you're saying here than a personal anecdote using I. Okay, so you could find a citation of something, or even if it was just a website or some kind of essay, it would be okay to add something like that in here. It doesn't take the place of your research-based texts, but you could add a citation if you wanted to add this concept of what parents often do and cite it. Obviously, research-based is better, but you cite something, and that would make it a little more appropriate for this type of writing than this personal story, okay? So the other thing I wanted us to talk about is citations. And of course, I see these headings that would need to be fixed, as we talked about before, but we've already covered that, so I'm not going to spend time on that right now. I'm going to jump down to the end, and I'm going to point out the reference page. Now, this person did a pretty good job, because if we look at the example, it looks pretty similar, right? We have references centered. They did do that. They've got all the sources aligned left, and we have this funny thing we do in APA where we tab and indent the second and the following lines after the second as well in the citation, instead of being all aligned to one side. So this person did a good job at that. They did alphabetize it. Seems like they did a good job. It looks appropriate to me. But one thing you need to do, which I noticed when I read this, is you need to make sure as you're keeping this reference page, did I actually use all these people? Sometimes we use someone like McCormick, Capella, O'Connor, and McClowry here. This citation must have been edited out or revised, and they took that section out, the person who wrote this, because I went back through and I could not find McCormick anywhere. So that would mean that I would really need to be careful that I'm not leaving them in my reference page. And this is something that actually happens quite a bit, because many people will make their reference page as they're working, and as soon as they find a source that they think they're going to use, they put it in there so don't forget, which is very good way to do it. But at the end, you need to go back and make sure. And if you didn't use it, take it out. Even if you thought, well, I did read it and it seems relevant, well, that may be the case, but if you didn't actually cite it, then you don't put it in your references, okay? So if you really think that person is important, go back and figure out where do they belong in your paper. All right, so that's it for today. Hopefully this helped you think about revising and editing your paper, and you can find some things that you need to work on. And as always, find a friend or partner to check it for you. More eyes you get on that paper, the better it's going to be. Good luck.